For those watching on the live stream, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. All the details of the panelists you'll find in the chat below your screen. And please share any questions you have in that chat, as those will be passed on to me to ask a little later. Stay tuned in between the panels, because we're going to be sharing some content from our partners during that time, and at around 7:45 we will then come back with our second conversation. We're going to finish the event at around 8:30. I always like to say around, because one never knows with these things. Please feel free to tweet and Instagram and LinkedIn Live, share the message of this event. We're going to be using the hashtags Fashion Revolution Week and Sustainable Fashion. So let's get on with the show. Anna and Paul are here with me in the room, and I have Carlo and Heinz joining me virtually from Germany and Switzerland. Please can I start with Paul? Can you introduce yourself and your role?
So good evening everybody, I'm Paul Alger from the UK Fashion and Textile Association. Getting a bit of feedback there. My main role is to help UK companies to export, but before you can actually get them to export, you have to take them through the hoops of getting things manufactured. And obviously, as everyone knows, the UK industry has been talking to itself about sustainability and traceability in the supply chain for at least the last 10 years, if not considerably longer. And so a part of our role is to help companies to understand some of the obstacles in their way and to look at solutions that we can recommend to them to help them to make their lives both profitable and green.
Thank you very much. Anna.
Hello, my name is Anna Ellis. I'm Head of Business Development at Making for Change, which is part of the London College of Fashion, and we sit in the Department for Social Impact. And what we do is that we work with communities in London. We have a lot of engagement with the local community through storytelling, through creativity. We also work with training women in prison, and we also have a manufacturing unit where we do manufacturing basically for startups, for young brands. We also do training, and we offer employment opportunities.
Thank you very much, Anna. And next to Carlo, please.
I hope you hear me well. Good. My name is Carlo. I'm the founder, one of the two founders of HeiQ. HeiQ is a London-listed company that is active in materials innovation. And one of our latest innovations is a new cellulosic fiber, HeiQ Ionic, which can replace polyester, which is one of the biggest issues that we have in the textile industry, and where we are strongly engaged with our brand partners to have this big change from an old legacy technology that is very polluting to something biodegradable, circular, and sustainable.
Thank you. And Heinz.
Hello, everybody. So it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. And I'm Principal Sustainability, working at Hugo Boss now already since 25 years. And it's really a journey that I went through. And since about good over 10 years, I'm into the topic of sustainability. So started to create the roadmap for Hugo Boss and was really following up different areas. We have done a lot of LCAs, so we digged into natural capital. And one of my favorite is, of course, fibers, because the product starts with a fiber. And so we're really into cotton, regenerative cotton, we're into wool, and that's where Carlo and myself early met, into also innovative new fibers, which definitely this one is a interesting story, and we're gonna deep dive tonight into that.
Yes, there's going to be lots of opportunity, and actually Heinz is going to give us a short presentation a little bit later about the work that he is doing with Carlo. Paul, I'd like to come to you first, if I may. It's been 6 years since the Ellen MacArthur report, and at that time that report was proposing a radical overhaul of the way textiles and clothes were designed. And the ambition for that was to mitigate the disastrous environmental impact of fashion. Do you think, and I think that you touched on it in your introduction to yourself when you said talking to itself, the industry has been talking to itself. Do you think we've seen the level of cooperation and action that's needed to bring about change from manufacturers, brands and retailers?
It's a very good question because, and it's one that we struggle with quite a lot. The industry has spent most of the last 10 years talking to itself about sustainability, traceability, ethical trade, and all of those key issues. But actually the people that make their final decisions on where their money is going to go and what they're going to buy and how much they're going to pay for it are actually not in this room. They are outside here. They are in our streets and high streets up and down the country. And I certainly have spent quite a lot of my career, I've been doing this for 30 odd years now, not vilifying, but certainly being very critical of retailers for some of their retail buying choices. But actually it's the consumer. And we're all consumers at the same time, so we all have a part of responsibility on this. And responsibility means that we have a responsibility to understand some of the key issues. And I think one of the big challenges, one of the big frustrations that we have is that we're 6 years from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation report, we're 10 years from the Rana Plaza collapse, and yet we're still at the beginning of this process. I would say there is a long way to go, and it's sometimes frustrating that we haven't got quite a lot further. And I think one of the issues that we found certainly on the UK fashion and textile industry side of things is that there is no real understanding even within the industry of what sustainability and traceability and ethical trade mean for fashion and textiles. Fashion designers have a pretty good understanding. Most of the London Fashion Week designers that come out of our world-class universities here have that instilled in them from a very early age. They are making commercial decisions that make their commercial lives more difficult, but because they're looking to protect the planet and the people that we all need to look after. But when you come to look at sort of textile production, for example, which was responsible for the lion's share of the pollution of a lot of these problems, then there are not easy options available. So I think that we are in a position where we are at the very beginning of this. And one of the big challenges that we face, certainly from the UK, is that the UK industry is very much niche-based around quality premium products that we primarily export. That part of the industry has done an amazing job of cleaning itself up and looking to the future. But the vast majority of the fast fashion that has been mentioned is coming in from outside our shores. It is not meeting a standard that we would require goods to be made to in the UK or in the European Union, for example. So I think we have to have, on a policy level, some really interesting conversations with ourselves as an industry and as people about what sort of an industry we want and how government can make the situation right for those things to happen and for progress to be faster. We talk a lot about race to zero. We talk a lot about, greenwashing, but all of those issues, it's very difficult to quantify most of them.
And let's get on to some legislation in a moment. You talked about textile innovation, and we're going to talk to Carlo and Hein shortly about their partnership. But you also mentioned world-class universities, and Anna, you are working very closely within the London College of Fashion. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you feel is wrong with the current linear production system? And maybe for the audience, for those that don't know, and I'm certainly one of those, you can explain a little bit more about what that means and why that production method is so damaging.
So our traditional production method, and that relates to our traditional retail and selling method, is you take the resources, you're using cotton, for example, you make a product, you sell the product, and then you discard what you don't sell, or you discard what you no longer need. So that's pretty much the linear way, and that's the way we've been doing business for a very long time. So from a retailer's point of view, for example, they will make an estimation as to how much they think they will sell. And bearing in mind, and obviously we have experts in retail here who can speak more to this, but bearing in mind that they know that there will be a certain percentage that will go into sales. So factoring that in, you are already making more than you know you are going to sell. So then your manufacturer will make it, using all the resources needed to produce this. Your consumers will buy what they can, what they will, at full price or at reduced price. And then what do we do with the rest? So as a consumer, you might think, okay, I'm going to give it to charity, I'm going to give it to Oxfam, etc. They have so much, there's only so much they can dispose of, and then that gets shipped. So our problem then gets shipped overseas, and we're filling landfill up in other countries. From a retailer's point of view, you know that there's X amount of stock that you now have in your warehouse. What can you do with it? Can you delabel it? We tend to do a lot of giving away, giving to charity, giving to other countries, etc. But really, the linear way of producing is we're making effectively more than we need. So we want to try and turn that around. And at LCF, we have students who have that mentality. They really do want to look at making and selling only what. So we have that sort of sell and make rather than make and sell mentality. But the problems that we have is the whole industry is geared towards volume production. So we have a lot of brands that come to us, startups and small brands who really want to work in that way, but the prices that sustainability basically, brings up makes it very unaffordable for a lot of businesses and a lot of brands to work in that way, even though we want to. So our challenge, in a nutshell, is changing the way we work, but changing it in a way that still makes it commercially viable.
And we're going to touch a little bit more on the commercial viability in the next panel, and a little bit around wholesale prices, everything that goes into the production line. So for those that are tuned in, please continue to watch to hear more about that. Heinz, I'd like to come to you. You've recently announced a collaboration with HeiQ, a Hugo Boss range, which is the first product made with HeiQ Aonic. And this replaces polyester. I'd love you to tell me a little bit more, if you will, about the range. And I think you're just going to show us a few slides, which would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
While Heinz is just pulling up his slides, I'd just like to say to Joe Altieri, who's joining us on LinkedIn, thank you very much. Yes, this session is being recorded. It will be available directly after. And please do send in any questions that you have. Our team here at Sec Newgate are fielding those questions to me. Thank you. Heinz, over to you.
So, yeah, thank you very much. So that's where we stand for, and I think that's really, we stand for a bold and better future. And Daniel always has a clear message to all of us. That's the DNA. We love fashion and we change fashion. And I think that's important. If you have this from our CEO as a message to all employees, then you will understand why also this collaboration comes across. Little bit of journey, just to highlight. You see, we have started very early with really nice products that we believe is something better than just the conventional one. So we had started with a traceable wool, where you go to the best wool farmers in New Zealand. We had a nice collection with Pinatex. We used for leather tanning, Oliven leather, which is made out of olive leaves. You see, we had a plastic-free collection already to retest what is possible. And you see, throughout all this, we always had something new, which then we broadly brought into collection. And the latest was a regenerative collection, which really tested what you can do with, let's say, products coming from agriculture. And it's really important to know agriculture for fashion. We have about 60% cotton. So you see, we're really based on natural fiber. But, and I think that's really important, why we put reduced polyester. It's still polyester. I think it's not maybe our major problem, because we are now about 10%. But if you look, and that's, I think, is really important, if you look to how was the development over the years, so you see until the 2000s, so until last millennium, it was more or less a synthetic, half a natural fiber, the other half. But you see, the growth came only through, and is still coming from polyester. And polyester is a funny thing. On one side, it's an endless, durable fiber, but the problem is it's mostly cheap, and that's why it's really used mainly in areas where you throw it away. I have to say, I'm a bicycle rider. I have, from a Swiss company, over 20-year-old garments And that's where polyester is made for. It's durable. But most of our waste we generate comes from polyester and other cheap synthetic fibers, which then end in some way in a waste. It's sort of dangerous, and it creates microplastic. That's why I think it's really important that we clearly, before we look in the future, we look what is our problem. And that's definitely, it's the synthetic fibers. Of course, then with all the processing in it. And that's where it comes in place. And I think then, Carlo, you can take over, because that's where your home base is. But for us, the message is why we have started this partnership. It replaces polyester through a cellulosic yarn. Cellulose is Carlo, you can really deep dive, is the material we have in the world. We don't have to invent it. It's there. It reduces waste and pushes circularity in. That's, again, something I was really happy doing a lot of life cycle. All the fibers normally still have an impact. But with this fiber having a carbon positive fiber, having something that absorbs carbon, you can grow. And that's really where, for us as a brand, these three elements make this fiber something really unique. And that's why we want really to build on that. And now, Carlo, take over, because I think that's where these unique partnerships come. And by the way, the first garments you can buy already on our shop. And we have done a very nice collection with Matteo Berrettini, our tennis star, which is an ambassador for our new collection.
Thank you very much, Heinz. And Carlo, yes, if you would like to just tell us a little bit about the genesis of this collaboration.
Sure. I mean, challenges. There's plenty of challenges that we are facing. We are coming up with a radical solution to a gigantic problem. The problem is 110 tons of polyester million tons of polyester produced each year. So that's a mountain. An entire mountain each year that, for the most part, goes, as Heinz mentioned, to landfill. You all have seen images of the Atacama Desert full of old textiles, or even in Kenya on the beaches and other places, this accumulation of waste of textiles. We waste most of our textile, and most of it goes to landfill. So the challenges of the collaboration are that here's a well-established fashion brand that has taken on now the ESG DNA and wants to change fashion. And we are a material innovation company, but together we are out against what is a super cheap fiber that oil industry has enabled. And we need to fight it with the same tools. We also need to use waste to manufacture our cellulosic HeiQ AeoniQ fiber. So the challenge is really on multi-levels. First of all, get the right feedstock. We have the right partner with Hugo Boss. Second, it's scaling up, because we are starting with a new technology and need to build capacity. And capacity always requires a lot of investment, and investment requires commitment from brand partners. That's also why we reached out to a brand like Hugo Boss, and are reaching out to other big brands to engage with us and to commit to what is this off-takes of these new fibers that we will then scale up. So we can build capacity, and we can build it quickly, because we don't have very much time as a society to solve this problem. So that is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing, and we've been able so far to really tap into cellulosic waste stream from agriculture, from the food industry, or also from old textiles, by working with partners that recycle and make old cotton textile circular. And from these three feedstocks, we have been able to spin the strongest fibers ever made out of cellulose that have the potential to replace polyester. And when disposed in a landfill, which is still going to be the way how we humans work with textiles, we don't recycle very much, 1%. Textiles globally is only 1% recycling. But we have created a fiber that enables biodegradation in 12 weeks, complete biodegradation in 12 weeks in your backyard, and not 1,000 years like polyester. So challenges that we're addressing with technology.
Thank you, Carlo. And for those watching online, you can see a video in the middle between these panels around HeiQ and that biodegradation. It's fascinating to watch. Carlo just talked there, Paul, about a radical solution. What's stopping more brands and retailers adopting radical solutions with circular production methods and materials like this?
I think it's the point that I made earlier on. I think the moment we start to talk to people about let's buy less, let's buy better, let's buy more expensively, that the cost of your production is going to go up, you then have a lobby in the UK, and that's not unique to the UK, that says hard-working, cash-strapped families can't afford that.
Especially right now.
Especially right now in the cost of living crisis. So I often get very frustrated because you have a whole generation of consumers who feel that they are entitled to go and buy 2 t-shirts from Primark for £5 without really considering who made them, what they were paid, what circumstances they live in. And from that you understand that in our Western definition of sustainability, we also look at ethical trade, which is perhaps a big differential between the West and the East. China in particular will talk about sustainability as being kind to planet, but when we're talking about sustainability and traceability, we're actually also including ethical trade in there, because we're being kind to the planet because we also want to be kind to the people that inhabit it and to make sure that it's here for us in millennia in the future. But I think one of the things that has always held us back is a lack of understanding of the challenges, and that some of the figures you've heard already are important. I wanted to add a couple of others, if I may, just very briefly. I'm not a statistician, so I wrote them down, but we produce in the UK, we buy in the UK 4 billion garments every year, 1 million tons of used textiles. 25% of that goes unused, unsold, to your point earlier on. Less than 1% of it is recycled. That leaves us with 350,000 tonnes going into landfill, which, to put it in a British perspective, you could fill Wembley Stadium 10 times over with the amount that is there, and that's not the worst case. So there's a number of challenges here, and they are affecting the industry at different points. And so I think the premium industry is making great strides towards a cleaner industry, but it's actually the merchandise that we either produce cheaply closer to home, and there's plenty of opportunity to do that, but also merchandise that we import into the UK, where we glibly say we've reduced our carbon emissions by actually just shifting them off to Asia. So I think that's a big challenge. Then on top of that, you have the political dimension, which is governments have 5-year cycles. They tend to look at things that are in front of them, and most of them don't actually understand the global nature of the textile and fashion supply chain. It's incredibly complex. You only have to look at the conversations around cotton and the Uyghur minority in China to understand how difficult it is to actually identify where something is actually made and who made it and how.
Anna, I'd like to pick up on something there, which is around that risk, not just to society, but to business, if they don't transform to a more sustainable and transparent circular model. I'm thinking about an Associated British Food owns Primark. What is the risk? And in an ideal world, what would a circular textiles garment economy look like? What's your vision, your utopia?
My utopia, let's see. So in an ideal world, the materials that you're using would be obviously, not polyester or something that's never going to, never going to go away, basically. So you would be using more sustainable materials. And by sustainable material, I don't necessarily just mean cotton, because the production of cotton textiles has its own problems. So to Paul's point, it's such a long complex supply chain, and everything along that way has to be amended in order for us to get to that ideal situation. So that ideal situation where the materials that are being used are biodegradable. The design process, so when you're actually creating that garment or whatever product you're making, you're thinking about the end use of it. So once it's finished being worn, how many times can it be worn? Can it be resold because it's made so well that if you no longer want to buy it, you can give it to companies that now do resale, and somebody else can wear it and love it because it's made so well, it will hold up. And then eventually, when it gets to the part that it can no longer be worn, how is the end life of that? Is the fibers able to be broken down and turn into something else as the material is biodegradable? So it's really that whole supply chain from design onwards that we need to be thinking about. And also, to Paul's point with regards to costs, we have, like I was saying, we have a lot of the younger members of our society, students and people who want to start their own brands, not necessarily young, but people who want to start their own brands, really are thinking about sustainability, and they really want to do this ethically. But the quantities are small, and the prices are expensive. And if we're really going to make an impact, we do need the big boys. We need the Primarks and the Sheins, heaven forbid, and ASOS, etc. To really, they are the ones that are going to make an impact.
And to be fair, they all, if any of them were in the room, they'd say, we are trying. And that would be your response. It's too small.
It's too small, and there's no reason for it to be this small for this length of time. In my opinion.
We're getting a bit of feedback over there. Heinz, can I come to you, because we're talking about what's happening currently. You're already very involved with technical innovations. What else? Can you give us a sort of sneak peek on what other key trends there are that are going to affect fashion production in the next 5 years?
Thank you. So I think this is what we just had with discussion now, Carlo and myself, on Ionic is just one. We will definitely see more such innovation technologies coming up, be it in fiber, be it also in other materials, where I think the most important will be that they are, first of all, scalable, and secondly, of course, you cannot just grow it out from a let's say, not a waste product. So it must be something that is a byproduct of something existing to really reduce sources. Another thing is definitely what we are talking is all the digitalization throughout the supply chain. So we go digitally on the market, but very often behind stands somebody that keys in all the data. I think we really have to involve the whole supply chain in a digital way. That will really be something that is going to change. So the digitalization is coming. We're talking about blockchain. We're talking about other technologies that really influences the way we collaborate. And this is, of course, again, going down to farmers. And again, also there, it's at the moment a big buzzword. Everybody talks about regenerative agriculture. But again, just today I had two really interesting discussions about it. Again, it's really seen, and cotton there is just a cash crop for farmers, but it's a holistic system. Again, you see, we can't see fashion out of the global problems. So again, also when we go to agriculture, we have to do agriculture in a way that the farmers can benefit. And the bigger thing is really where we see the impact today is in manufacturing. So again, there, if we have done some natural capital, the biggest impact on planet is not coming even from fiber. So taking away polyester, taking away PET bottles, that's just is something else that try to green it, but it is still the same problem. But where we really have to get a new way of producing is in manufacturing, where really huge impact lies. And again, we see a lot of chemical factories coming with new recepts, which really we had also today a discussion with a German and dye stuff supplier. complete change. So there is a lot coming that really makes products something more sustainable. And at the end of the day, we have to simply go away. And I think that's again the trend to go to something. Fashion will be a value, and that's why we have to create garments that represent the value and not just something that I look at it, buy it and throw it away. So we have to go back to the values, which is again then a trend in the future. We also go back to dress up, be nice, be fashionable, and that's is definitely something that comes back. So we have to give the garment the value that you care about it and you can resell it.
Carlo, is there anything that you'd like to add in terms of that technological innovation that you're seeing that you're particularly excited by? Oh, sorry, that was to Carlo Heinz, my apologies.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
That question was to Carlo, please.
Okay, Carlo.
Say again, sorry, reception was bad.
So I was just saying you're obviously at the center of technological innovation at the moment. Are there other trends that you're seeing that you're particularly excited by?
Look, yes. I mean, there is, again, if we go back to the root cause, and the root cause is really using plastic to make textiles for the large majority. Okay, that's the problem. And throwing away the plastic and not recycling it, that's the second problem, which is a consequence of the root cause. So as Heinz mentioned, we need to go back and use materials that are intrinsically sustainable. Cotton is manufactured today in ways that meet that qualification and that can be also recycled repeatedly. Now, one aspect in the manufacturing that is trendy is also on the dyeing side. Dyeing is using almost a third of the footprint of the manufacturing of textiles, and has also consequences on the biodegradability later. So there's a lot of efforts on natural dyes and ways to dye in a more sustainable way, with less energy, with less water, and with less chemistry, if you want them. So that's another trend that we are supporting with other technology innovations from HeiQ. That is a part of the equation. So there's many young companies that are putting in and chipping in the sweat equity and the brains to really move and change an industry. But even if you put us all together, we are still microscopically small in establishing in a gigantic industry. Textiles is, just keep that in mind, it's just gigantic. So we own so much textiles as citizens, and we buy each year almost 40 pounds new textiles per citizen Earth, and throw away half of it each year. And if that's plastic, you see where the issue is. So I think the trends are there on making the manufacturing process more sustainable. We lead on the fiber side, others lead on the dye side. Others again lead on the recycling and circularity side. So the movement is there, but it needs to be fostered. It needs to be groomed and supported. And that is where the brands have to take ownership, take responsibility now, and give these new technologies, even if they are at the moment, because they're not at scale, more expensive, but they need to give them right now coverage. They need to give them access, even if on a small part of the product range the brands don't make the normal money, they support the growth of these better technologies. So that's the trends where we are.
Paul, Carlo was just saying there, this needs to be fostered. What would you, whose responsibility would you say that is? And what I'm getting at here is, what does the policy landscape look like at the moment? And I'm thinking particularly around the UK, because we have a long history here of innovation. And since the pandemic, and I think maybe even since Brexit, there's been a shift towards reshoring, but is this the case in Britain? And what more can the government do, would you say?
So the UK industry came together to promote reshoring and nearshoring as part of a sustainability drive for the last 15 to 20 years. And that was originally done independently. It was the industry coming together saying, we can't carry on like this. We recognise our responsibility and we need to make some change. And so one of the examples I was going to give you, which is very exciting at the moment, is sometimes the solutions are actually underneath our very nose, because the UK has a heritage manufacturing capacity in wool. So for example, if you look at companies like Begg of Scotland, they're now working with Inuyo, who are one of the original shoddy manufacturers, for example, for those that can remember back that far, back into the 1850s, which is when I was a young boy. And to actually take fibres that are no longer needed from woolen products and to actually put them back into viable fibres. So that is circularity in some ways in its broadest sense. So there are areas, and wool is one of those fibres that enables you to do that. Cotton potentially could be doing that as well. Much more difficult when you try to look at recycling and cleaning feathers, for example. Down is often, because it costs you often more to clean it than you actually can sell it for. But certainly looking at the UK government, the government has come to this party slightly later than perhaps I might have liked, as governments often do. But at the moment, we're looking at the potential investment from the government of something like 15 million, I think it's 15 million pounds, I wrote it down, 15 million pounds over 8 years in a programme to support industry to make it greener, certainly to make it, where did I get it?
And is that focused on
Here we go.
textiles in particular, or?
It's a £15 million circular fashion fund with 6 pillars over 8 years, looking at circular business models, novel technology, sustainable manufacturing, with an aim to get to net zero in 2050. Well, we'll see if that happens.
Is that enough? I mean, 15 million would be a lot to me, but is that enough?
It's a start.
Right.
It's a start.
It's just a long time, 8 years.
It's a start, and I think the problem with these things is, again, as I said before, governments tend to come and go every 5 years, sometimes more frequently. And so what we need to do at the moment is to rebuild a lot of the UK's infrastructure. And certainly over the last 30 years, we have found that we are without dye houses in most cases in the UK, for example. So there are elements missing from our national infrastructure which need to be rebuilt, and this will be a start. But we need to do a lot more. The other thing I think that needs to be looked at, and this is a personal view, is that government also needs to look more about the information that we give to consumers about where and how products are made. So, for example, if you go into a shop and you look at the label, and you should always read the label, will tell you where things are made and who made them. But if you go online and try to buy that same item, the chances are that you will not see any of that information. There is no requirement for that information to be published. So consumers are actually not able to access a lot of that information that they would be able by law to access if they were in a shop.
Anna, Paul highlighted there the greatness of the UK's wool manufacturing of old. What would you say are the UK's strengths as a manufacturing location? I know that you do a lot of work giving women training to make clothes to fill the skills gap. So what would you say the UK brings as a textile and garment manufacturing location?
We have the skills, we have the quality, we have the location. So if you're thinking about reducing your carbon footprint, we're right here. Quantities, we are, especially our garment manufacturing, most of our garment manufacturing don't make the hundreds and thousands that you churn out coming out of Asia. So you can make smaller quantities here. Made in the UK in itself is a brand to help with the value of your product. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits. I mean, really what I'd like to see in manufacturing is for it to get the respect that it deserves. We still have a kind of this sweatshop mentality to any time you say a factory or any time you say a manufacturer. And there is a real skill in what we do. It's a real skill in making. It's a real skill in sewing and pattern cutting and weaving. And we really need, and again, I think that's education, to give it the respect that it deserves so that a younger generation will feel as if, yes, we can go into that industry as a maker, not just as a designer or a merchandiser, but as somebody who actually machines and weaves and sews and puts it together. So there is a lot of value that we have, and we just need to have the skills. In fact, there's a skill shortage because so many people want to make here that we need to start to cater to that. But yeah, we really do need to change the way we look at production, change the way we look at manufacturing.
And also change the way we communicate it, as we said, because coming back around, and we're going to take some questions in a moment, to what we were saying at the beginning, with a cost of living crisis, you can see that people are going to make a judgment call on what they're willing to spend their money on. And so going to a shop and buying something very cheaply is going to be the way that many people do it. So it's that sort of communications juggernaut that needs to be shifted as well.
And I think it's also worth saying that, and speaking with UK manufacturers as we have been at UKFT for the last 6 or 8 months, the big complaint is also the cost of fuel. So although we have the most deregulated fuel market in Europe, we also happen to have the most extravagantly expensive cost of fuel. So that makes it more expensive to produce things here. So when it comes to government intervention, government needs to be looking at how do we give British businesses access to clean, cost-efficient energy that they need to keep their factories running. So
to create that virtuous circle. Thank you. I'm going to open to questions to our in-person audience and to our audience on LinkedIn and on YouTube. Please do send any of those through to me. I've got Abby and Ruby very kindly manning the fort there. So please, to some questions. I'm going to feel a little bit like one of those talk show hosts. Hello. I'll come and be with you over here. So yes, Daniel, it is, isn't it? Would you just say your name and your organisation, please, and present and who you'd like to ask a question to?
Yes, I'm Daniel Novello. I work for All About Browne, which is a men's swimwear brand, part of the Chanel group. It's kind of a statement, kind of a question. We've talked a lot about ethical trade. No one's really mentioned living wages here.
We will in the next panel, but definitely yes.
So my question or statement is rather, is there something in the fact that Anna mentioned there was a skill shortage. No one's mentioned living wages. We've mentioned about sustainable fabrics. We all want to push in that direction, but no one seems to be pushing the direction of should we be paying the garment workers more, giving them living wages, allowing them to progress and live in their society that they do. We all live in a cost of living crisis right now, but everyone's talking about margins and wants to push the product cheaper, not giving the people that actually make the clothes the opportunity to progress in their life. So maybe the question is to Heinz at Hugo Boss, who actually works for a brand. Is there something there in living wages that you're focusing on?
So maybe Heinz takes that, and I think Anna will have something to follow up as well.
Absolutely. I think the topic about wages is probably something which is a really old topic. So that's, I think, one of the first in the 80s. It started everything about wages and how laborers are treated, and living wage is something, of course, is not so easy to achieve for a brand which works with producers, because you're never alone. So what we try with our audits to really understand where they are, can we improve, what can we do more? What we have seen the most successful initiative based on living wage is where you have a tripartite. So you have the producers, you have the brands, but you have also the, the syndicates that really sits together and elaborate what is a living wage. That's where in countries where these initiatives started, the most successful ones, because it's not on one shoulder. So, and that's very often, we rarely have in our productions a share that is bigger than 10-20%. We are not a big play on that. And there, of course, you can influence, but really make it successful is, again, it's a tripartite where we really bring together the parties on a national level. You bring together the brands that works, and you bring together the local authorities to make it a success stories. That's what I have seen are the most successful way to get to living wages. And that's, I think, will be not an easy topic to get through worldwide. So it's really depending on which countries are you. And for example, Bangladesh, they wanted to shut down the accord where we were part to really improve it, because of course they were afraid that the production cost would increase so much that the brands would move out. And you see, that's where we always in this discussion in these developing countries, how much you can increase without losing the work on one side. And that's why it must be a bigger story than just one brand. And we can try to do our best, and really wherever we can join an initiative like the Accord in Bangladesh, we do it to really be part of this and not hiding away.
Anna, can you come in, given that point around it can't just be one brand, can you talk a bit more generally about how you feel about this?
I mean, London College of Fashion is a minimum living wage employer, so our staff, our manufacturing staff at Popular Works, at a start, will always start London living wage. And I think that's where education comes in, because we will have potential clients or brands who would like to be sustainable, and they definitely want to be an ethical manufacturer and being an ethical brand. And being an ethical brand means that you are, paying, you want the people who make your things to pay the London living wage. But then they want you to make a jacket that has 5 pockets and 3 zips, and they want to retail it at £20, which means they'd have to buy it from me for £5, and your London living wage is at £11.95. You know what I mean? So all of that does not add up. So I think the education part of that really needs to go out there for smaller brands, but also for bigger brands, because you have countries like Bangladesh who, at some factories in Bangladesh really sort of wanted to be sustainable and really put all of that infrastructure in, so they were recycling water, but then there's a cost to that. But then if you as a big retailer do not want to pay the extra 5p per product that sustainability factors will cost, then you're always having that sort of, so I think it's really educated. We need to educate consumers. Then the consumers will educate the retailers, and then it will trickle down to our manufacturers.
I think Jenny Holloway from Fashion Enter would say something very similar if she were here as well, that pressure on price is everywhere in every single part of the market. Unless you can break that circle, we're never going to get where we need to go.
Thank you. I've got one question over here. He's going to hold the mic very close to his mouth. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's, Anna, thank you. I think it's following on the same point. My name is Abby. I'm the founder of Plume, plant-friendly uniforms. So we are addressing a very, very price-conscious market, school uniforms. It's not the high-end luxury fashion. So probably a question to Paul. We were talking about the cost. So how do we think about maybe educating the customers that sustainable fashion doesn't come with a price tag? So that's challenging.
I'm glad you asked me that question. And you're in the second session, you're going to be treated to somebody, I'm not sure who it is, from Fashion Revolution. And there are a number of groups out there that are really very active in this space. But Fashion Revolution's activity is all about sensitizing the consumer to make better choices. So if you look at their website, for example, and I would recommend that you do this, have a look at their Fashion Transparency Index. It's a beautifully pulled together piece of work that comes up with some very surprising outcome. So people that you might think are very transparent are perhaps less transparent than you might, and some of those brands that I sometimes have tended to vilify over the years might actually perform slightly better, but that is the start of it, I think. And looking at things like their hashtag Who Made My Clothes is very important, because again, back to Anna's point, the volume market has been chasing cheapest needle and cheapest loom for so long that they don't know anything else. The only way they're going to change is if their consumers tell them to behave differently. So again, it does come back to the consumer all the time, I think, now.
Thank you. I have one more question here before we wrap up. Thank you. Just hold it nice and close. Thank you.
Hi. Actually, I have two questions.
Make it quick.
Yeah, I'll try to make it really quick. So, hi, I'm Williot. I'm a senior program manager from Cambridge University, and I very much run accelerator program to support staff. So it was great to hear the innovations, kind of in the material space. But first question, it's very much on kind of touching the living wage side of things, but in the supply chain, probably for all panelists and potentially maybe for the brand. So I did a postgrad study, and I did this whole kind of interviews with the supply chain suppliers in Bangladesh, over 15 suppliers there. They are all very keen to make their environment and everything more sustainable. But then they find it's really challenging is that the brands put those sustainability framework to them, which they are very happy to comply because they think it's good for them. But on the other hand, they also find a lot of brands, they request it, but then they don't have the intention to pay the premium price after the factories invest so much money into making their practice more sustainable. So I guess the first question is for the panelists, how do you think that we can support brands to not having this decoupling situation we see in the organization while sustainability team were trying to push so hard for their supply chain tier 1, tier 2, and so on to be more greener, but then the procurement team still asks for the lowest price. So that's the first question. I will be really quick on the second one. So on the second one, so we talk about circularities in the fashion industry. And it's wonderful. There are so many amazing innovations on the material side. But we also know if the business model doesn't go hand in hand, your material, the amazing material, still then go into landfill. Even if you will biodegrade quicker, faster, but then there's still a lot of resources from nature to go into that whole journey. So do our panel have any suggestions, I guess, is that how the brand business models can also go, adapt with all the new materials coming into the market?
Sounds like you should be on the panel. Who's it to? Okay, who would like to take that one briefly, please?
Do you want to go first?
With regards to, I'm not sure where to start. That was a. With regards to the business model, and I'm just using as an example of like a typical design house, for example, where you would have your designer, you would make the production, you'd make the patterns, you'd make a sample, and then you'd physically make the sample, and then you like, I don't want to change that, change this, make another sample, change that. So you might get 3, 4, 5 processes before you get to an actual product that you then want to take into production. So maybe you can bring technology into that. Yeah. So instead of making 5 garments that you're not really going to do anything with because they're all toiles and samples, why not bring technology into your business model and do a virtual sampling and do all of your changes in a way that doesn't actually need you to make samples. So it's really, it's hard, I think, to have a look at the whole picture and say, I want to do all of this. Maybe take it in chunks and say, okay, well, we've reduced our wastage in sampling because we're no longer making samplers. We've reduced our paper wastage because we're using digital patterns. There are ways of maybe thinking outside the box and using a combination of innovation and traditional methods. And as I was saying before, design perhaps with your end use in mind. You may have a lot of things that are ended up in landfill, but if it's biodegradable and it's ending up in landfill, you're using textiles that you're not able to control how it gets to landfill, but at least you know it's not going to stay there forever because the materials are biodegradable. So for that part of your question, I would say your business model needs to think outside the box and really look at how you can incorporate more sustainable practices.
And actually, you touched on this earlier, and I'm just going to bring in Andrew from Charles App, who has asked a question on LinkedIn. And he said, what about resale as a means of increasing the margins for brands? You mentioned this before, and reducing overall consumption of new things.
I mean, the most sustainable way of protecting the world is not to consume anything. We human beings consume things. We eat the fruit that we find on the trees, we kill the animals that we see in the fields, and we eat them. So there is always going to be an element of consumerism in everything that we do. If I think about some of the work that we've been doing with government around free trade agreements recently, there's a very enthusiastic approach from government about sustainability and empowering emerging economies like Bangladesh, for example, to modify the way in which they sell to us and to give them incentives to help them to make progress. But my one concern with those types of agreements is always there's no check and balance to make sure that the activity actually happens. So you have a situation where a country like, for example, Uzbekistan is added to that list, but there isn't any check or balance. There seems to be no rhyme or reason as to what the UK wants to achieve from that. But again, I think it comes back to one of the things that we've been doing for a long time in this industry is encouraging nearshoring, flexible, just-in-time production, because instead of buying 300 per colour per style from China, if you're buying 50 and then reorder 50 when you've made them, that to me is a very simple way of moving forward. But the challenge for that is, of course, Brexit drives a coach and two horses through that, because we now live in a world where we're being encouraged to tilt towards Asia. And the tilt towards Asia is a wonderful thing on lots of different issues for lots of different industries. But for the fashion and textile industry, potentially it can be a disaster because our carbon footprint will go through the roof. So as we solve one problem, we often create another, I would say.
We have a fantastic question from Kissy from the Songhai Advisory in Accra. She says there's so much second-hand clothing that's flooding our markets in Africa from places like the UK. It's a huge sustainability issue, but on the other hand, we're seeing an emergence of young designers who are turning this problem into a circular economy opportunity by recycling and upcycling second-hand clothes. So there is a global conversation going on here, which we want to continue. I want to say a big thank you to my panelists who have joined, Heinz and Carlo, virtually. Thank you very much. To Anna and Paul also for your time this evening, and thank you to you all for watching. Please stay tuned. There is going to be some video content from our partners, which is going to be streamed during the break. I'm going to give my in-person audience a little break, not too long, and then I'll look forward to welcoming you back in around 15 minutes. Thank you all very much.
If change is the only constant in life, would you rather follow the flow or be the driving force for change? This is where our path started, with nature as our witness.
Since 2005, we have pioneered materials innovation, making everyday products more comfortable, hygienic, protective, and sustainable. We stay one step ahead by leveraging science to solve everyday problems and through partnerships with global brands and manufacturers. Our global team of 30 nationalities on 5 continents collaborate closely with our partners towards bringing our Swiss tech inside quality promise to the world, improving the lives of billions. Our growth is driven by people, purpose, and planet, one innovation at a time. We can't wait to reveal what we have in the pipeline to further enhance life on Earth.
This is HeiQ.
Wearing good clothes means the people who made them receive fair pay for their work. But right now, most textile and garment workers cannot afford to live in decent housing, eat healthy food, or go to the doctor. They even struggle to send their kids to school. A living wage is not a luxury, it is a fundamental human right. We demand laws that protect the human right to fair pay. We want to see a living wage for the people who make our clothes around the world. The EU has the power to change this. Help us get to 1 million signatures for good clothes, fair pay. Sign now.
I think what interested me was that it wasn't just about sustainability in kind of the very literal sense of the word, it was more about the kind of empathic side of it and looking at actually the people.
They weren't just like, oh, make us prints or design something for us. They were really interested in what we wanted to say on our point of view as, like, I guess, the future of like the fashion industry.
My intention of a designer is to make something that people say, oh, can I try that on? Or something that people want to interact with. Whatever research material you started with, you're sort of spreading that around through experiences. And I think the fact that you have the potential to do that with clothes is really cool.
My group, we're kind of focusing on the transparency within making of the garments. So our main thing is understanding like policies and laws that are going into effect that make things harder for factories to practice ethics and sustainability within their factories.
With this project, I think it shaped me more to think innovatively. So how can this change the world? How can we change the world?
Well, I think it's put me in a very lucky position. This is like the first stage for me, and I've learnt this at the first stage, and that's something I'm going to take forward throughout my whole career.
A spark can cause a fire, so it is us that can spark that change and cause the fire, which is that change we are expecting within the fashion industry.
If change is the only constant in life, would you rather follow the flow or be the driving force for change? This is where our path started, with nature as our witness.
Since 2005, we have pioneered materials innovation, making everyday products more comfortable, hygienic, protective, and sustainable. We stay one step ahead by leveraging science to solve everyday problems and through partnerships with global brands and manufacturers. Our global team of 30 nationalities on 5 continents collaborate closely with our partners towards bringing our Swiss tech inside quality promise to the world, improving the lives of billions. Our growth is driven by people, purpose, and planet, one innovation at a time. And we can't wait to reveal what we have in the pipeline to further enhance life on Earth.
This is HeiQ.
Garden. For this second panel, we're going to be talking about how we can put the human element firmly back centre stage in the sustainability debate and present alternatives to fast fashion. And I'm delighted to be joined by Delphine, by Donald, by Susanna and by Gavin, and I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Hello to those watching on the live stream. A reminder that everybody is able to tweet, to Instagram, and we've got a couple of hashtags we're using: Revolution Fashion, Fashion Revolution Week, and Sustainable Fashion. First of all, to Delphine.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm Delphine, I'm the Policy and Campaigns Manager for Fashion Revolution. So Fashion Revolution started following the collapse of the Rana Plaza, which happened in 2013 and killed over 1,000 Bangladeshi workers. One thing to note is that the Bangladeshi workers that were killed actually knew that the building itself was not safe, and yet they still had to go back to work. And the reason is because their wages were so low. So following this collapse, brands and the people who were on the ground actually had to look through the rubbles to find the labels of the brands that were producing in this factory. The reason being that the fashion industry is not transparent at all. So one thing that Fashion Revolution wanted is greater transparency within the fashion industry, so that when events like this happen, first of all, they should never happen again, and second, we would make sure that brands who are producing in those factories are being held accountable. So Fashion Revolution was created as a grassroots movement, and we're present in over 80 countries. And as part of that, we focus on cultural change, policy change, and industry change. So my role within this is to advocate for better legislation within the fashion industry and ensure that we have good research so that when we speak to policymakers, we are able to back that with a lot of data, basically.
We love data. Donald.
Hi, Donald Browne. I've spent 49 years in the fashion industry. First 16 years running my own factories in London. 30 years as production director at Ted Baker. My responsibilities was the product, getting it made, fits, quality, and moved on to the whole social aspect of it, so sustainability, ethics, pretty much everything to do with the product and any role that no other director put their hand up to do. I spent my last few years at Ted Baker really concentrating on people in the industry, educating people, bringing young people into the business and helping them to gain a culture and an understanding of the fashion industry. My past 3 years, having left Ted Baker, we set up a company called THE-CØDED, which is all about the people within the industry, particularly the supply chain. So it's putting the people that make the products first. It's all about these very, very skilled people who spend their whole lives producing what we wear, but are completely undervalued. So our aim is actually to educate the consumer by educating our future leaders, our future influencers into what's going on in our supply chain. Well, they actually have very little idea of what happens within a factory. So our aim is actually to educate, to revolutionize the whole industry, as to think in a different way about the product, why you buy the product, what's the reason for buying it, and what about the people behind it? Are they getting a fair share of the retail price? And the format that we have at THE-CØDED actually gives them a much fairer share of the retail price, and we're hoping that this might perhaps catch on, and the more people that do this, the better off the people in the industry will be.
Susanna.
Hello everyone, I'm Susanna, co-founder and CEO of Birdsong. Birdsong is a social enterprise fashion brand, and we work with women facing barriers to employment to make our clothes. So we work with migrant seamstresses, refugee embroiderers, elderly knitters, and we pay everyone London living wage to make our clothes. We have been going since 2014, and we recently have pivoted slightly or expanded into more of a B2B model. So we're launching our new business, I suppose, side of the business on Saturday, and we have set up a little printing hub in Poplar, which is the area that most of our makers are based in. And our makers from refugee backgrounds are printing merchandise for other brands, businesses, charities, you name it, we'll print it. So happy to be here.
Gavin.
My name's Gavin Miller. I work for a trade union called Community. Community are a general trade union. We've got a number of sectors where we represent the workforce. But Community's history is we're predominantly a manufacturing trade union. The reason I've been invited to speak today is the area where we've got recognition with the most companies is within the UK boot and shoe sector. We've got some other areas, some hosiery areas and the like, but generally speaking, boot and shoe is our particular area of interest. So it's more your higher end, made in Britain being a very respected mark. It's that kind of a market that they sell into, but they're not without their challenges. Community are a trade union who like to work in partnership with good employers, and I do use the word good employers in that sentence because you can't work in partnership with a bad one. So yeah, we're a union who always try and work with employers. There was a sentence I heard many years ago that kind of sums up our ethos, that we use the force of argument, not the argument of force. So any of you who think that trade unions are these people who just stand outside all the time agitating people, that's kind of not what we do. We mediate, we resolve, we work with people, and we are a union who tend to get good results for our members.
Thank you very much. So we touched right at the beginning there, Delphine, on 10 years since the collapse of Rana Plaza. And I think that we would all agree that a huge amount of work has gone into improving conditions, but there's still a long way to go. And some, I think, would say that from a corporate sense, there has been a real shift towards environmental sustainability rather than the rights for workers. If I can actually come to you, Donald, first, and I'll come to you next, Delphine, would you agree that that's the case? And if so, is now the time to rebalance?
Yes, but not purely the product or the planet. You know, there are organisations that do focus on the people within the industry, but their voice isn't heard as much as the product. You know, we just had a talk all about product and fabric.
And actually, one of our guests asked the question at the end of that, and I'd urge those watching to listen back after this, making the point that we haven't talked about the living wage in that product conversation.
Well, we actually at THE-CØDED, we did an experiment with Central St Martin's, and I know there's a few people here that attended this challenge. It was a collaborative challenge, and the whole essence of it was to see whether or not the students understood what happens within the supply chain, whether they know the way people are treated. And the very first reaction was shock, horror. They had no idea of what's going on. And we weren't doing it to shock them, we were doing it to educate them. And as a result, we were getting the most amazing feedback from this challenge that we did. It was 145 foundation students that thanked us and couldn't believe what was going on and promised us that they would be the influencers of the future and that they wouldn't want to work for companies that treated people like this. They wanted everybody that makes the product that they wear to get a fair or a living wage. And that almost gave us the direction for our business, which was education. This is the way forward.
Delphine, Fashion Revolution is the world's largest activism group in this area. And next week, you'll be hosting Fashion Revolution Week, when you're going to be highlighting these human rights and environmental issues in the fashion industry. Can you tell us a little bit more about your campaigns and the focus at the moment and for the coming week?
Yeah, absolutely. So Fashion Revolution Week is, although it happens during the week of the Rana Plaza Remembrance Day, which is the 24th of April, generally we have 7 days of action across the world with our global network and all our country teams that take part into highlighting these issues. So different countries will focus on different issues and their own campaign. At the moment, we're leading an EU-wide campaign called Good Clothes Fair Pay, which demands legislation at EU level on living wage due diligence across the manufacturing and processing level. The reason being that at the moment there's a huge legislation being discussed within the European Union called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this legislation...
They always have snappy titles.
Yeah, I know, the CSDDD for short. And ultimately, this legislation would push companies to conduct due diligence, so ensure that they really assess their human rights and environmental risks. The issue with this legislation is that it doesn't really cover the whole industry, the whole fashion industry. And so we're really pushing for this campaign to ensure that living wages for the fashion industry is taken into account into this new legislation. The EU doesn't make it easy, and so as part of this campaign, we not only had to draft a legal proposal that took about 2 years to draft, but also we then have about 12 months to collect 1 million signatures from anyone with an EU passport. Again, it's not an easy feat given that we're also operating across different countries, different cultures, different languages, so we can't collect 1 million signatures just from Germany or just from France. We have to also make sure that there's an equal spread of those signatures. So if anyone in the room has an EU passport, please go to goodclothesfairpay.eu or please share it with your network, your colleagues. So this is one of our leading campaigns, and the reason we're focusing on the EU specifically is because the EU is the largest importer of textile around the world. And so when they implement legislation that impacts the fashion industry, it has global ramifications. So anyone or any brand who wants to sell their products on the EU market then has to comply with legislation. And as we know, lots of British brands, most brands globally would sell on the EU market. Therefore, even if their supply chain is based in Bangladesh, in Brazil, or even in the UK, they would still have to comply with this legislation. So it's absolutely key that when we think about EU legislation, it's not just about the EU, it's also about the world. So that's one of our leading campaign. But I know we have Birdsong on the panel. We also work actually as part of a project called Small But Perfect, which is an incubator for SMEs, and we try and support them into their sustainability journey. My role within this is to provide a policy perspective to not only highlight the legislation that's in the pipeline that's going to impact them, but also ensure that they know the different avenues that they can take in order to also campaign for the legislation that they want to see within the fashion industry. Because I think, especially for European SMEs, it's incredibly difficult to make their voices heard, and very often they're overlooked. So that's another project that we have in the pipeline, and Birdsong is one of the brands.
And I'm going to come to Susanna from Birdsong in a minute. If you want to find out more about any of those initiatives, those campaigns, Good Clothes, Fair Pay and Small But Perfect, there's going to be linked to those in the comments underneath the live stream, so please do engage with that, and there will be links to all of our panellists as well. Susanna, as Delphine was just saying, there is a new generation of ethical businesses, Birdsong and THE-CØDED being great examples of that. But how are you doing it? Because as we heard earlier in the earlier panel, this is a real challenge at the moment. And with the cost of living crisis, it's an even bigger challenge. So tell us your secret sauce, if you would.
I'm not sure if I've got any secrets. There's no denying it is definitely a challenge. So we are a social enterprise, which means we're a business, but we put impact at the same level as we would profit. Yeah, it's an enormous challenge. I think we have to keep constantly educating our customers to kind of explain, you know, our price point, the value that's in our product that isn't just the aesthetics. Hopefully the aesthetics will win people over, but you know, there's so much more to the product. We just work really hard on all aspects of our business. As a small business, we can control everything. You know, there's not a lot of hierarchy. There's, you know, the buck kind of stops with me. So we just try and ensure that every aspect of our business is as sustainable as possible. Manufacturing in the UK and paying living wages means that our cost price is naturally very high. So, you know, that's why we've had to pivot our business model to account for that. Before we were making dresses, you know, knitwear in the UK, a jumper or a dress can take 5 hours to make. And if you're paying £11.95, that's what, £55? Ish, don't check me on the math. So we've had to pivot our business model to create a product that is not like less quality, but and has the same impact, visual impact, but is faster to make, and we can still make it in a sustainable way using sustainable inks, etc., organic cotton. But we're constantly having to pivot and
nimble.
amend things exactly.
Speaking of being nimble, I think it's harder, or even harder, to be nimble as a big brand. And Gavin, I'm not coming to you as a representative for big brands, but I would like to know, given your experience within the industry, and then Donald, I'd like to talk to you as well, why does it seem so difficult for big brands and more established retailers to pay the living wage or even a fair wage?
I thought you were going to accuse me of being nimble for a second.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
that sailed many, many moons ago. I think it's a question of motivation. There are brands who are ethically treating their employees. As I mentioned, you know, our exposure within the boot and shoe sector, typically speaking, we've got companies who are hundreds of years old, family owned, and the families are still involved with those companies. Is everything perfect? No. But are they employers that care about their workforce? Yes. The difference there, though, is, you know, you've got price points of £250 upwards for the products that they're selling, because people are happy to pay that because it's a handmade product, it's a high-end premium product. So in those circumstances, there is a will to treat people properly. They do look after their workforces. However, you know, it's not perfect. I won't name any names in terms of brands because that wouldn't be fair, but I do know one international brand that everybody in this room and everybody online would know, who manufacture a pair of trainers for about £12 and sell it for many, many, many hundreds of pounds. Now, the workforce don't get that reflected within the payments that come to them. So it's a question of your motivation. It's your consumerism versus your capitalism argument, I suppose. And capitalism, what a word that is, because it's such a small word that encompasses so many different angles and arguments. I'm not completely opposed to capitalism, but I suppose if there's ever such a way to have responsible capitalism, that's the way, because as a trade unionist, I would rather speak to an employer who's earning money, so I can then say, right, I want some of that money to go into the workforce's pocket. It's a far easier conversation than going to an employer who's earning nothing and saying, I want some money to go into their pocket, because you can't get blood out of a stone, can you? So it comes down to the motivations of the companies. It's that the ethics of the companies. The fast fashion argument does feed into it, and I don't want to kind of use that as a bit of a cop-out, but the motivation of how quick can we turn around, how quick can we get a quick buck on our garments is certainly there. It's not there completely, though. There are some good examples out there, so it's easy to pinpoint the bad, but I think you've also got to balance things and say there are companies who've got that will. But they work in an incredibly difficult trading environment. You know, if you're manufacturing in this country, pretty much everything is against you. Business rates are against you, energy prices are against you. Let's be honest, you know, we're talking about a UK-based argument. This is a global argument. Your labour costs are against you when you're looking at labour costs in other countries. It's very difficult for those employers to turn a profit. And also, you know, we don't really have a manufacturing strategy out of central government as I see it, and I respect anybody's beliefs in the politics they've got. I'm not doing a party political, but there's obviously a bit of crossover on this. I can't fathom why we don't have something that I see as a joined-up political strategy. I'm sick of short-term political thinking. I want long-term political thinking that furnishes this country with a strategy for 20, 30, 40 years, not a strategy that says, am I going to win my seat at the next election? Because that's not why people get elected, to my mind anyway. You know, in the room, everything you see in the room has been manufactured. The people on the live stream at home, everything in the rooms they're in has been manufactured. Everything you touch, you use, has been manufactured. But yet we don't have a manufacturing strategy. It's good that, isn't it? But anyway, sorry, I soapboxed slightly there. I'll stop now.
There's a call to action there for anyone watching in the policy world. Donald, you spent 30 years with one of the biggest brands in the world, Ted Baker, in a very senior role as production director. And we were just hearing there from Gavin about a £12 pair of trainers being sold for hundreds and hundreds. Could you tell us how a big brand gets to the price that we see on the shop floor, and why might paying the living wage, fair wage, make them bulk?
Yes. First of all, if I could just say to Gavin and Paul from earlier, my first 16 years were having factories in London. I gave up my factories. I came out of manufacturing in the UK because there was no government support.
Yeah.
So that's why I actually left manufacturing. Brands and retailers have only really got one thing in mind, and that's margin. That's what they work for, profit. Any business, it's about their profit. And if they're not making a profit and consistently increasing it, there's trouble. The chances are they won't survive. So most brands and retailers, it's about margin. A lot of those companies, and I can particularly talk about the one I was working with, they work from the top down rather than from the bottom up. So they would look at a product, they would put a retail price on that product that had been designed, and then work out how much do we pay for it. Now, that is such a wrong way of working. You should always, we from production, from the other parts of the business, we're looking from the bottom upwards, working out this is the cost, therefore this is what we have to sell it for. But when you're looking at from top down, or what we call input margin, which is to say, if that's £100, we're going to pay £20 for it, regardless of the costs involved. It's £20 for us to sell it for 100. And that's as simple as it is for certain companies. Obviously, there are other companies that work on much bigger margins, like buying something for £12, selling it for hundreds. Now, what we mustn't do is everyone will think that is shocking, that's terrible. But the fact is, those companies will have much larger overheads. They probably spend an absolute fortune on promoting their businesses, on advertising, marketing, PR, social, everything else. And that's part of their costs. So even though companies will have huge markups, it doesn't mean they're making huge profits. it means they potentially have huge costs as well. But that isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is not that they want huge markups. It's not that they have to be profitable, because if they're not profitable, they'll be out of business. And if they're out of business, then they're not getting goods made, and then the whole industry suffers. So there has to be a different solution.
We have a comment from Nuala, and excuse my pronunciation, Nuala, Browne Tracy on LinkedIn, which leads me nicely into a question I have for Delphine. She says, transparency of the supply chain is critical. The food we consume is regulated and the supply chain can be traced. This should be the case for fashion and textiles. And transparency to me seems to be the key issue for ethical production, and there's a lot of green hushing we know that goes on. Customers aren't given the information to make informed buying decisions, or if they are, they have to really hunt for it. And we were hearing earlier about it's not necessarily online, you have to go, and when you're in the shop you have to really look carefully. So Delphine, can you tell us a little bit, and you mentioned it before, but around the importance of the Fashion Revolution's Fashion Transparency Index, which I think is published in July.
Yes. So I think we often say transparency is not, well, it's not the same as sustainability ultimately, and I think that's commonly, commonly mistaken. But what we'd like to say is transparency ultimately leads to accountability, which ultimately leads to change. You cannot have change without a certain level of transparency, because ultimately what you can't see, you can't fix. So with this in mind, this is why we created the Fashion Transparency Index, which reviews and ranks 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers based on their publicly disclosed information on human rights and environmental impacts, policies and practices. The reason being that ultimately there was no transparency. I mean, there still isn't. There is still very little transparency and traceability within the fashion industry, where we're seeing that brands sometimes do not even know where the supply chain is based. They are not, all their suppliers lists are not in the public domain at the moment. And bear in mind that we've been doing the Transparency Index for about 7 years now. And since the beginning, now we're only at 48% of brands actually publishing their tier 1 suppliers list. And those are the largest brands and retailers in the world. So you have entire sustainability teams dedicated at communicating sustainability, and yet they're not even able to put that information in the public domain, which means that if there's an issue in a factory, they're not being held accountable. The reason is no one knows that their clothes or their products are being produced in that factory. And that's a huge issue when you're working from the ground up. So again, it really shows that transparency is absolutely critical for change. And the way we use our transparency index is for anyone reading it, whether you're a policymaker, you can definitely use, we're actually talking to policymakers right now to make sure that when we ask for specific indicators, they include the methodology that we use for the Fashion Transparency Index, because we cover over 250 indicators, so it's quite an extensive work to create this data set. I'm the one who makes it, so it's honestly, it's a mammoth piece of work where we collect all this information into one place where policymakers can actually think about what kind of questions should we ask companies to put in the public domain to make sure that it's relevant and to make sure that we regulate the industry. For trade unions, we make sure that this information is all collated so that when it's all in the public domain, we can have trade unionists on the ground cross-checking the claims that brands are making. We actually work with an organization called Clean Clothes Campaign, cross-checking all our living wage data, where if a brand is claiming we're paying a certain percentage of our government workers a living wage, they're able to cross-check that data on the ground as they have the resources to do that. Ultimately, it's very much about empowering anyone with that information, but ultimately we're very, very far from where we need to be. The average score for the Transparency Index is 23%. And that is to say that even if a brand had a score of 100%, they would still not be sustainable. Sustainability is not the same thing as transparency. What we need is to get brands to disclose more information, to hold them more accountable. And I know that at EU level, the European Union is trying to create legislation to debunk myths and make sure that consumers are actually empowered. I think the new legislation is called Empowering Consumers and Substantiating Green Claims. Those two legislations at the moment, I'm not quite sure how we can implement legislation that is substantiating green claims when the data is simply not there. How many factories in the fashion industry are actually collecting environmental data, whether that's energy data, water data, waste data? Not many. And I think that's to say, like, there's very little data, so how can you even substantiate anything? The data is simply not there. And so when we talk about empowering consumers, we mentioned earlier made in the UK. You could sew a button on a t-shirt in the UK, make the entire t-shirt somewhere else, and say it's made in the UK. There is no legislation countering this today, so I think that's really important as well for anyone in this room to know, is that ultimately we do not have the legislation, we do not have the tools at the moment to ensure that, like, the fashion industry is transparent and is accountable. So this is why we've created this entire report as a first step. Ultimately, it's not sufficient, but we know that it's definitely a necessary first step.
Susanna, as a brand that is very focused on transparency and social enterprise, can you tell us a little bit about how you're doing that? And then I'd like to get from Gavin and from Donald a little bit around and I'm saying if here, Gavin, right? If legislation is coming, what can retailers and brands be doing to get ahead of the game? So to Susanna first.
Yeah, sure. So we are B Corp certified, which is
no easy feat.
Yeah, it took us like over a year to do it. So they review, 5 areas of your business, governance, environment, community, your makers, etc. And we received, I think it was 117, and the median to pass you have to get 80. So it was like an outstanding score for a small enterprise. So I'm very proud. We are very transparent about everything, the good, bad and the ugly about our business. We try and be quite idealistic about our business. As fairly young founders, we can do that, and we want to influence the wider industry as a whole. So instead of Black Friday every year, for example, we do Transparent Friday. So we disclose juicy facts about our business, like what we all earn and how much money we've made, etc. And we give the consumer a choice. Once they've read through this quite long blog post, they can then have options for discounts that they would like to take. So that's up to them. But we make them read through our manifesto and report. So yeah, I think I totally agree with Delphine. Like, you can't. It's really good to declare your even not so sustainable parts, things you want to improve on, because it really holds you to account, and people will respect you more for it.
Maybe to you, Donald, first, around what retailers can do to get ahead of the game. Yep. And also, I'd really like you to touch on some other remedies. You've mentioned to me taxation in the past that you think could be factored in.
I don't know whether we want to talk about that. But I actually agree, and part of our education is to explain to people that sustainability is not transparency. We're exactly on the same track. You cannot really be sustainable until you're transparent. You have to know what you're doing. You have to tell other people what you're doing. The problem we have, particularly in the UK, is you'll get criticised for what you're not doing. Mm-hmm. So people tend then not to want to be transparent because they don't want to be criticised. But the key is, we have to be transparent. That is the answer. And then once you are transparent, you can then work on what do we need to do, and you can get support, you can get help. And there perhaps not being a solution, I'm actually working on a solution for transparency for the industry. Which is it's a master data solution that it's a cloud-based solution that will actually give people the information they require and the transparency they need right from the very, very first process, which is if it's, for instance, cotton, where is it farmed? And then everything along the way, we call it from first thread to second life. Literally, we can track it, we can trace it, we can give DNA to actually prove this is where the cotton comes from. We can show you water usage, we can show you carbon emissions, we can show you salaries that are paid along the way and how they compare to a minimum, a living, a fair wage. and we take it all the way through to the consumer to advise them on how to deal with their products after they've bought it and when they don't want it anymore. So there are solutions that are going to become available for the whole industry, for retailers, for the consumer. And the whole idea is that this information should be on every garment on a QR code, so anyone can read it from their phone, and it should be on every website, on every product that you look at, and it will give you the total history of that product right up to now. That's what we're working on. Now, whether or not there are other solutions, absolutely. I think there should be taxation on certain products. I think anything made of polyester should have a tax on it. And that tax should be used to fund how do we change the industry going forward, whether it's to pay living wages or whether it's to find alternatives to polyester. We should be able to support the circular industry. How do we deal with everything that gets thrown away? And the problem is, and we spoke about fast fashion, I don't believe fast fashion is bad. I think it's just the terminology that we use. You know, because everyone thinks fast fashion means it's cheap. We used to make things quickly, so that could be called fast fashion, but it wasn't cheap, and people were getting paid more than a living wage. So I don't think the answer is, let's stop fast fashion. It's we have to change the whole essence of what fast fashion is. You can still produce things quickly and pay people fairly. But the problem is that we are producing too much. And with the second-hand market as well, that's creating even more product in the marketplace. There are solutions, but they're long-term.
Gavin, I saw you nodding when Donald was talking about legislation on labelling. Is that something that you feel strongly about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a brilliant idea. I'm going to steal your idea on that one, Donald, definitely. The idea of a kind of product passport, I think, is a great idea, because the previous panel touched on it. The job of work that we have that I don't really know where the beginning and end is to this, and we need a bottomless pit of cash to get anywhere near an answer to this, is educating the consumer. The previous panel touched on this in detail. Now, you know, a lot of consumers will walk into Primark, 2 t-shirts for £5 and not care. But 2 t-shirts for £5 is everything that's wrong with the world. Because if everybody's earning along that chain, there's something wrong there. Mm-hmm. So the idea of a product passport, it's not a bad idea at all. So I think Donald's really onto something there.
Okay, just say it's not just me.
No, take it.
I'm not doing this in my spare time.
Well, I'd vote for you, Donald. I think on the wider picture of what mechanisms do we have to police this, we've got legislation now, but the problem is we've got UK legislation for a global problem, so it's very easily bypassed. We've got things like the Employment Rights Act, we've got 2030 Net Zero, we've got the Modern Slavery Act. You know, all of these are fine pieces of legislation that provide some protection. But I suppose one thing being a trade unionist teaches you is you can have any piece of legislation you like and any agreement with an employer that you like, and it can be as binding as you want it to be. But once you've got it written down, if nobody then polices it, it doesn't happen. So the job of work isn't getting the legislation in place. Don't get me wrong, that's difficult enough, and I'm sure our political colleagues would tell me they have terrible times with that. You can get it in place, but then you've got to go and police it. Now, when you look at, as a country, when we set up bodies to then police legislation, we don't have a particularly good track record with that. We set up bodies that are, typically speaking, and this isn't every example, that are burdened with bureaucracy, that are about questions, not answers. They don't address the policies that they're meant to police. And let's be honest, in the areas we're talking about, if we got something where we've got a group that polices these documents, you should be looking at convictions in certain areas, because the only way you stop poor working practices is to follow it through with strong consequences, sends a message out to the rest of the industry. Again, you know, I am speaking very idealistically here, and I appreciate we have the most multi-layered debate of any of my work within the union. But yeah, as a country we need to get a lot better, and I think in terms of policing any policies that we've got, that would be a great start.
Thank you. Now I'd like to open to the audience for any questions. And to anyone who is watching also virtually, please do send any questions through to me. Yes. And if I get close to your mouth.
Okay, hear me?
Yes, and could you say where you're from, your name?
Yeah, my name's Gemma, and I'm a MA student doing the Fashion Futures MA at LCF. And in both panels, actually, what I've been sitting here and thinking is if we're ever going to have a sustainable fashion industry, are we all going to have to get used to paying more for clothes? Because one of the things that I've witnessed through my working career, because I was a designer, is just the massive price deflation that's gone on in the fashion industry. And I can't square how we'll ever have a sustainable industry with prices that continue to drop.
I can take it. Well, I think there's two things. On one hand, whenever I hear about the cost of living crisis and this is why we need fast fashion and this is why we need clothes that are affordable, no one needs a 99p bikini. I think we can all agree on that. This is not going to be the spending that you need to do in a cost of living crisis. What I mean by that is ultimately, we often hear the argument by consumers and by brands that if we increase the prices of certain items, it means that they're not going to be affordable. There's actually the first thing, fast fashion is not fueled by people who are actually struggling to pay their rent, pay for food. The fast fashion industry or the fast fashion business model is actually fueled by people who have a lot of spending that they're able to do, and instead of buying an item for £100, they're going to buy 10 for £10. I think that's the first thing that needs to be flagged when we talk about affordability. Affordable for who? The second is also how affordable is it to when you have a business to base your entire business model on the fact that you rely on poverty wages in order for your business model to function. How affordable for who when the people who are making the products that we're selling are not even able to buy nutritious food for their kids or pay their rent or have to go into debt every single month for you to be able to buy a dress that, if it was £10 more, you wouldn't have bought it. Well then, don't buy it. I think that's the thing is people in this country probably have enough clothes as it is in their closet. I think that's also something where the UK is the largest consumer of clothes in Europe already. How many people in this room actually need more clothes? I think we can all survive on the clothes we already own. And if we do need to, if we need to make sure that our clothes are, made to last, so we can repair them, we can, mend them and so on. And if we do need to purchase them, I think we need to think about what is actually, affordable for who when, you buy from a small brand, like a brand like Birdsong, for instance, where they've made sure that the people who have actually made the products have been paid fairly so that the clothes end up on the market, but you're also sure that across the entire supply chain there is something fair, and no business model should function so that you rely on poverty pay. It's not sustainable. It's absolutely not. There is no sustainable fashion without fair pay, as we like to say at Fashion Revolution. So I think that's the first thing is when we talk about making things more expensive. I think again, I'm absolutely not for the luxury sector making products for £12 and selling it for £100, making it or doubling an item or a bag, as some fashion brands have done recently, so that they can be at the same price tag as other bags that are considered extra luxury. I think that's not what I'm saying, but ultimately it's about finding the right balance between what we consider affordable and what's actually affordable for the people who make those clothes. I think that's, yeah.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, okay. You'll have to fight it out between you, but make sure you hold it close to your mouth. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually think we need to...
Could you say your name and where you're from, please?
Sorry, I'm Lynn Pasterny from Earthside. I actually think that we need to give more credit to consumers. They don't actually want to be part of environmental damage and human rights abuses. So in the EU, when the deforestation-free supply chain law was being discussed, consumer polling overwhelmingly showed that people did not want to have deforestation in their supply chains. They didn't even want to have a choice. They just wanted it banned from their supply chains. Now, sadly, cotton is not yet part of that law, which was actually passed yesterday by the EU Parliament, but leather, thankfully, is. But I wonder, is it really that we need to focus on educating consumers more, or do we need to just focus on passing laws that force companies to do better?
And actually, I might even add to your question and comment, because I think my name is Jimena Vanegas and I work for Changing Markets Foundation. And I think throughout this entire evening we've heard how, in both panels actually, how consumers should be the ones educated. But recently, for example, we've launched a campaign called greenwash.com. It's a site where you can actually access more than 100 items sold both in the plastic, fashion, and food sectors, where massive multi-million dollar companies market their items as green or with green claims and are entirely greenwashing. So how are consumers meant to, choose these items or choose something when companies are actually actively deceiving the consumers? So that's...
Are your questions to anyone in particular?
No, I think maybe more of a general comment.
I'll start.
Yeah, go for it.
I think it does sit with consumers. And I know the research said consumers wouldn't want to see deforestation, but I would have loved to have seen a follow-up question to say, do you want to see your clothes prices increase? Because I bet the answer to that would have been no. We've got a long-term problem. And I do think, actually, I don't want to do a Whitney Houston here, that I believe that children are the future, but our younger generations get this. They get it. They're more ethically savvy, responsible. They look into these things, and it does give me hope for the future. But this is a long-term solution. The British mentality is get a bargain. Oh, look at this, I got this from the shops, I got a bargain. That's the mentality, is buy it as cheap as you can. And while you're buying it as cheap as you can, somebody loses. To your question before, I think the price of things may have to go up, if I'm being completely honest with you. And as a trade unionist, that's really difficult to say, because you've got people who are struggling to survive on the wages they make. I cannot think of a faster way to strip dignity out of somebody than they go to work full-time for a week and they can't feed their family at the end of it. I can't think of a faster way to take people's dignity away. But just going back to the question there about the consumerism part, the companies could be doing more, but the companies, to me, yes, they can be ethical. Yes, they can tell us about the wonderful things they're doing. But ultimately, a company's decision is going to boil down to one thing: is it making money? Because if it's not making money, the policy will change. The company will work within the framework that's given to them to turn a profit. That's my view. Oh, hugely. You tell me where to sign, and I'll sign up to that one. But that'll always be the driver on that front. There are some companies who are different. Honest, I'm not tarring everybody with the brush, but most would fall into that category. And the biggest companies, the ones who are selling the most volume, definitely fall into that category. Again, I won't name names, but there are some horror stories out there, and I'm sure you know them as well. So I do think consumer drive is where it starts. A week, 2 weeks ago, we saw Gary Lineker send a tweet about migrant crossings in boats, and look at the traction that got, because people suddenly started paying attention. The power comes from the people. I know that sounds incredibly socialist revolutionary, which isn't what I am. But that's where the answer to this, to my mind, comes.
Okay, final question. Thank you.
Hello.
I'm so sorry, Delphine.
Just to quickly answer, I think from my perspective, I would actually tend to slightly disagree with the fact that I think ultimately everyone in society has a role to play. And I think we absolutely need binding legislation within the fashion industry, having seen that voluntary measures, and obviously I work on living wages, voluntary measures on living wages have been there for decades. They're not working. This is why, obviously, on one hand, consumers are really helpful, because obviously that's why we launched our campaign, to make sure our voices are heard with policymakers, and we need that 1 million signatures from, citizens. So that's the power. We never talk about consumers at Fashion Revolution. We talk about citizens, because people often forget that the fashion industry can also be regulated. They think they can act through their purchases, but not act by talking to policymakers about the fashion industry. And I think that's something that's really, really crucial, is that we can, as citizens, also call for the legislation we want to see within the fashion industry. So I think that's the first thing. The second is, obviously, we absolutely need for the fashion industry to be regulated. There's no questions whatsoever. Thank God the EU is finally waking up and doing something about it, but the legislation so far is not convincing. So I think we definitely need to have the conversation between the citizens and making sure citizens are actually empowered, but also making sure that the legislation comes through and that the industry also follows the legislation and is properly implemented. Because as you mentioned, I think the problem sometimes is that we see a lot of legislation coming through and it's not properly implemented. There's no fines, like the Modern Slavery Act, there's no fines, there's no way to actually police it. So I think, again, it's making sure that there is also follow through on that as well.
Thank you. Final question.
Thank you. It's Daniel again.
Hold it a little bit closer, please. Thank
Daniel again, asking another question. So we talked a lot about consumer education. My question is, do you think there's space for like a polluter pays policy or framework within the industry, and that's for the brands to be responsible for not only their environmental impact, but I guess their social impact as well in terms of ethical pay? That's to anyone that wants to answer.
Donald or Susanna, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think brands, retailers should be responsible for what they're producing, for what they're selling, for their actions or their inactions. But I also think that there should be legislation to counter all of that, because people won't do it off their own back. We, through THE-CØDED, we actually did a little survey whilst we were doing a talk at the Fashion Retail College to their students there. And we asked them, would you be prepared to pay more for your products that you buy from a particular, because they happen to be talking about, we also asked them where they bought most of their products, and they told us, and I won't say where it was from, it was just around the corner from the college. And we said to them, would you be prepared to pay more for your product in order that the supply chain, the people that make the product could get paid more, or that the industry could do better? And they said no. No, we're not interested. They know what's going on. That was one of the groups of people that we spoke to. They actually know what's going on in the industry, and they're not prepared to pay more if they have a choice. So I'm now of the opinion, take the choice away from them. Make it legislation, tax them, make them pay more. As long as we do something with that extra money, it's got to go back into the industry.
Susanna, final point.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, the responsibility lies with citizens, yeah, and definitely with brands to uphold, their ethical and sustainable, aims, and yeah.
I'll leave us with a comment from Nuala on LinkedIn. Cultural change is required. As a marketer, the narrative needs to change for us all. People need to become more aware, to become more conscious consumers. I hope you can all become conscious consumers, those in the room, by supporting the Pre-Loved pop-up curated by Emily London, the sustainable stylist upstairs. Please do continue to enjoy drinks upstairs and some nibbles. And I'm sorry to those on LinkedIn and on YouTube who aren't able to enjoy those, but I hope that you have enjoyed our time together this evening. A huge thank you to the panelists now and earlier, to Delphine, to Donald, to Susanna, and to Gavin. Thank you for your time. A big thank you to the Sec Newgate team for all their hard work, and in particular to Imogen for bringing us all together this evening for what I think is an incredibly important conversation, and I hope you will continue that conversation upstairs. Thank you also to 1185 for their production this evening, and that just leaves me to say thank you to you all and a very good night. Thank you so much. Fantastic. It was like, sorry, did you say
we agree.
Yeah, I know.
Areas are heavily legislated.
Yeah,
you could say one thing.
No, fashion is really